What would you do if one day, in the middle of a quiet village market, you saw a face you'd only ever seen etched into the stone of a gravestone, a face that belonged to someone who had died 10 years ago? Would you trust your eyes, or doubt your memories? It was a languid, brooding afternoon in the village of St. Elora, where summer clung to the hedgerows like a secret too stubborn to let go, and the air hummed softly with the scent of overripe roses and something older, deeper, the faint rustle of long-forgotten stories. Miss Katharina Wren, a silver-haired woman known for her quiet intuition and piercing gaze, sat in her usual wicker chair beneath the creeping ivy of Althea Manor's veranda, sipping tea with a deliberate grace that came only from years of watching the world unfold like a well-worn book. Across from her, Lady Althea Morven, the Manor's enigmatic mistress, poured a second cup and said with a tilt of her head, "The Ravenshade Cottage, it's been let again, to a woman from London, I'm told, a Miss Helena Ward." Young Thomas at the post office said she carries herself like someone who's seen too much to care for village gossip. Miss Wren stirred her tea, though her pale blue eyes flickered briefly with interest. "That house," she murmured, "has stood empty since the professor's body was pulled from the river, and his daughter vanished into myth." Before another word could be exchanged, the quiet creak of the iron gate snapped their attention to the garden path, where a woman glided past, tall, willowy, with raven dark hair and a stillness about her that made the very air feel off balance. She moved like someone unaware of being watched, yet somehow fully in command of the space around her, and when she turned slightly to nod, her face became visible, and both women stilled. It was a face not unknown but misplaced, a living echo of someone who had once lived, laughed and died tragically young. Lady Althea leaned forward, whispering, "Kathy, did you see her, that face?" Miss Wren's reply came after a pause, her voice as steady as a drawn blade. "I did, and I remember, by nightfall the village had erupted into a murmur of unease cloaked as curiosity. Helena Ward, the newcomer, was not just any tenant, she was the spitting image of Eleanor Alden, the professor's daughter who had drowned in the river 3 decades ago under circumstances still spoken of in the hush of candlelight. Eleanor, with her haunting eyes and storm-chiseled beauty, had vanished into legend, until now it seemed, when she had returned in the form of a stranger with the same cheekbones, the same unreachable expression, and the same impossible silence in her gaze. At the bakery, Mrs. Crimshaw dropped a tray of jam tarts when Helena passed by the window. At the chapel, Reverend Pembroke forgot the Lord's Prayer mid-sentence, and old Colonel Harding, who hadn't spoken her name in years, simply muttered to his cat, "She's come back then." But it was Miss Wren, with her quiet understanding of human nature and her uncanny ability to sense when the air shifted, who felt the chill most. Not fear, no, but recognition, the kind that seeps into bone and whispers that nothing returns without a reason. Then came the incident. Edward Alden, the professor's estranged brother, a recluse haunted by a past he refused to acknowledge, was seen in the village for the first time in months. He collapsed outside the greengrocer's the moment he saw Helena Ward, his eyes wide with something beyond fear as she rushed to his side. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady, and yet Edward could only look up at her with trembling lips and utter one word, "Eleanor." That name, buried under years of denial and rain-smeared gravestones, now sat fresh on every tongue. Eleanor's death had always been ruled an accident, a misstep by the riverbank, a young woman alone in the dusk, but there were always whispers of something darker, a quarrel in the woods, a broken engagement, a will rewritten just days before. And now, with Helena's arrival, those whispers were no longer idle, they were breath, fire, prophecy. The village held its breath. Miss Wren, ever patient, made her way to a church tea the next day where Helena was to be formally welcomed, and among sponge cakes and brittle smiles, she watched, truly watched, as Helena Ward smiled too politely, spoke too deliberately, and seemed always a fraction too aware of what was being said around her. And though her words were measured and kind, it was her eyes that betrayed her, for they did not sparkle with newness or wonder, but held instead a still, unsettling depth, the kind one sees in water too deep to guess at the bottom. Miss Wren sipped her tea, eyes never leaving the woman's face, and thought, ghosts do not always rattle chains, sometimes they return wrapped in flesh, looking for answers, or for revenge. She arrived just as the winds began to change. Ella Orne Grace, a woman wrapped in the kind of silence that made even the most talkative villagers forget their words mid-sentence. Her story, though carefully constructed, never quite settled comfortably in the ears of St. Niles residents. She claimed to have inherited the brooding, vine-choked Widdisham house on the edge of the woods from a great-aunt named Isadora, a name no one had ever encountered in the annals of local memory, and certainly not in connection with the old Widdisham bloodline, a family once whispered about in cautious tones until tragedy sank them into hushed history. Elwyn, with her refined speech and curiously detached warmth, explained that Miss Isadora Widdisham had passed quietly in Edinburgh, leaving behind the estate a trunk of locked letters, and an aged diary she had yet to open. But it was the way she spoke, her voice smooth, rehearsed, and too even, that stirred discomfort, like music played just slightly off-key. She deflected personal questions with polished charm, yet her eyes would often betray her, flicking sideways, catching on shadows, hesitating just a moment too long before speaking of childhood or lineage. In Farthing's general store, amid tins of biscuits and jars of barley sugar, she lingered at the far wall where faded village photographs were pinned beneath dusty glass. One particular photo, a group of young women standing near the weir, held her attention too long. Her hand, slow and deliberate, reached toward it, fingertips trembling not from cold but recognition. She whispered something too soft to catch, then turned away with a brittle smile that cracked at the edges. Miss Caldwell, watching from the counter with the sharpness only years of quiet observation could teach, felt something slip into place, not quite a fact, not yet a suspicion, but the weight of a truth long submerged. That night, unable to sleep, she reopened her personal copy of the Village Chronicle, flipping back to the spring of '91 when Clara Widdisham, aged 23, was found drowned below the weir, shoes missing, hands scraped raw, as if she'd fought against something or someone. It had been ruled an accident, of course, despite whispers of a broken engagement, a bitter will dispute, and a letter she had reportedly written the night before, one that vanished before it could be read. Miss Caldwell stared at Clara's photo now juxtaposed in her mind with Eloan's face, and felt her breath catch. The likeness was chilling, too precise to dismiss, and the timeline off by just enough years to be manipulated. Had Clara survived, changed her name, and returned to reclaim what had been denied, or was Eloan someone else entirely, someone who knew far too much? In the days that followed, villagers began to murmur of oddities, windows left open at Widdisham House though no one recalled seeing them opened, lights glowing in the attic long after midnight, and footsteps pacing steadily when no visitor had arrived. Even more unsettling were the sounds, soft weeping, the echo of a music box playing a tune no one remembered teaching their children. Eloan herself appeared increasingly haunted, her composure thinning by degrees, as though the house, or what it remembered, was unwrapping her carefully layered facade piece by piece. Niles, a village that buried its tragedies in polite euphemism and let the past stay politely dead, found itself staring into a mirror it had long avoided, and what looked back was not a reflection, but a reckoning. The past, after all, does not forgive being forgotten, and some stories, no matter how well buried, return with teeth. Zara Moran's arrival in the forgotten, fog-wrapped village of Hollowick was less an event, and more a quiet disruption, like the subtle shift of air before a storm, sensed only by those attuned to old wounds and older whispers. She came under the guise of a manuscript restorer, drawn, so she claimed, by the village's peculiar silence and aged architecture. Yet the rhythm of her steps, the way her eyes scanned the crooked lanes not like a stranger discovering, but like someone returning, unsettled the few who still remembered what had happened 23 years ago. It began subtly. Mrs. Pelham, the apothecary's widow, noticed the indigo shawl Zara wore on misty mornings, its left tassel frayed just like Mara Ellison's, who vanished on the very eve of her engagement without a trace. Grange, who had run the tobacconist shop since before the war, remarked in hushed tones that Zara hesitated before mirrors the same way Mara had, as if expecting to see a different face staring back. But Miss Elspeth Dray, the village's aging historian and quiet sentinel of its darkest corners, saw something far more disturbing. Zara's uncanny tendency to linger near the Ellison cottage ruins, her fingertips brushing against scorched stones as though recalling memories no outsider should possess. When she referred, off-handedly, to the silver birch that used to lean near the garden gate, a tree that had been cut down 2 decades ago after Mara's disappearance, Elspeth's blood ran cold. No local had spoken of that tree in years, and certainly not in Zara's hearing. On the 3rd Sunday of her stay, the church bell rang thrice before sunrise, an old signal once used in times of death, and yet no one had pulled the rope. That same morning, the chapel's door was found ajar, and the Ellison family Bible, which had been locked away in the vestry for decades, was discovered open. On the altar, the page marked with Mara's favorite passage, Psalm 139. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. Zara denied any knowledge, claiming she'd slept soundly, but her voice held a tremble too rehearsed, her denial too polished. That evening, young Elsie Grafton claimed to see Zara alone in Daylun's Grove, a place where silence hangs like cobwebs and children are forbidden to go, kneeling beside the old rotting oak and whispering softly to the soil, as though in confession or communion. And later that week, the local milkman heard her humming a lullaby that hadn't echoed through the village in over 2 decades, a haunting melody only Mara's mother used to sing during harvest moon nights. But the most chilling shift came when retired solicitor Nigel Morvan returned, Mara's former fiancé, long vanished into city life, now back with the air of a man chasing closure or avoiding it. At a parish tea, he spoke of Zara in carefully measured words, calling her remarkable, but visibly paling, when she entered the room, his teacup trembling, as he placed it down and excused himself early. Miss Dray watched closely, noting how neither of them acknowledged the other, and yet both looked like they already had. And when, days later, the crypt beneath the Ellison chapel was found disturbed, not broken into, not vandalized, but simply opened, its dust scattered, a single pressed violet placed atop the stone coffin lid, the entire village began to shiver in quiet unison. For in Hollowick, where memory is as heavy as fog and the dead are never far from the surface, Zara's presence was no longer a curiosity, it was a reckoning. She did not need to claim Mara's name, for the village had already begun to remember it for her. And if Mara had indeed returned, not just in face, but in footsteps and forgotten grief, then perhaps the question wasn't just why, but who had summoned her, and what secret still buried was demanding, finally, to be unearthed. The faint wistful melody drifted once more through the hedgerow, curling like a forgotten breath of memory on the breeze, a tune Miss Marple had last heard in the tremble of young Clara's voice, her fingers weaving wild flowers with a gentleness that now seemed ghostly in hindsight. She did not turn toward the sound, she didn't need to. Some things, like the ache in a remembered song, belong only to those who were truly present when it was sung. But now, decades later, the same notes rose again, softly hummed by a stranger, whose silhouette seemed far too familiar. With sponge cake in hand, and her heartbeat just a shade too fast, Miss Marple walked on, her thoughts already steeped in shadows. The village of St. Mary Me had long memories and longer silences, but the return of Eleanor Gay, bearing not just the face, but the unmistakable grace of the late Clara Priddle, had begun to unravel a tightly stitched past. Whispered recollections, once dulled by time, now sharpened, the modest inheritance left to Clara a mere weeks before her death, the suspiciously timed visit to a solicitor, and Basil's quiet resentment at losing control of the Priddle accounts. Clara, once a dependent figure in her own home, had stepped into financial autonomy, and days later, she was dead, a fall into the river dismissed as tragic mischance. But inheritance breeds more than wealth, it breeds motive. Ivy Harmon, the retired parlour-maid, with a mind like a mousetrap, and a fondness for salt licorice, remembered something peculiar. Clara near the river, face flushed with fury, confronting a tall man in a dark overcoat hours before her body was found. No face, too many trees, she said, but the anger was clear. Not distress, anger. And while Ivy had stayed silent under her employer's warning back then, now, with Eleanor's presence rippling through the quiet village like a dropped stone, she wondered aloud if she'd witnessed the start of something foul. Miss Marple listened, her thoughts snagging on the coat, the stature. Not many men had come calling at the Priddle home then, not openly at least. Outside the chemist shop, peppermints in her pocket and questions in her mind, she walked slowly, thoughts layering like frost. Meanwhile, change crept into Eleanor's posture, the poised walk now halting, her curtains drawn tighter, her smiles wan. Mrs. Strange, who ironed linens for the respectable homes, noted the shift first, but it was only when Eleanor confided in a hushed voice that the truth emerged. 3 anonymous notes slipped silently through the door at night. No signature, only cruel, cold whispers. You don't belong here. And in the stillness of the village, with memories stirred like sediment from a long-settled riverbed, Miss Marple felt the unmistakable chill of a story not quite finished, of a death perhaps not accidental, and of a haunting tune whose final verse had yet to be sung. The note appeared without warning, no sound of footsteps, no creak of the garden gate, just a single folded slip of parchment, slipped like a secret beneath the back door mat, waiting to be discovered like a buried sin rising from the grave. Its paper was fine, almost too fine for a village like Brackenton, ivory white with a faint scent of something old, lavender maybe, or dried roses, and the words etched across it in looping feminine script were simple, chilling. We remember the truth. There was no date, no name, no context, just that quiet, bone-deep threat that settled into Elsinore Vale's throat like cold water. Most wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. The postmistress remarked how well she held herself, and the grocer admired her politeness. But Miss Hargreaves, watcher of small things and collector of subtle lies, saw past the practiced smiles. She saw the flicker of dread in Elsinore's eyes when children laughed too loud, the tremble in her fingers as she handled change, the sudden stiffness whenever anyone mentioned Clara Marchand, the girl who had died, or disappeared, or perhaps neither, 22 years ago under circumstances no one had ever quite clarified. Fear, true fear, is never dramatic, it hides, it festers behind neat appearances, and Miss Hargreaves had seen too much of it in her life to be mistaken. Of course the village hummed with theories, whispered with relish over lace-curtained windows and after church teas. Some claimed the notes were pranks by local boys, others insisted it was the vicar's youngest daughter, overly fond of Gothic novels. A few remembered Elsinore's resemblance to Clara, with a little too much intensity, murmuring about old sins that refused to be buried. But Miss Hargreaves believed none of these shallow stories. She suspected something far more dangerous, that someone truly believed Elsinore wasn't just like Clara, but was Clara, or worse, had come in her place to complete something Clara had never finished. And what unsettled her most wasn't the cruelty of the message, but the confidence behind it, the unnerving certainty of someone who wasn't guessing, but remembering. Mrs. Whitcomb, the vicar's soft-voiced wife with trembling hands and a fragile sense of what ought to be spoken aloud, let something slip one afternoon over a pot of oversteeped Darjeeling. They'd been discussing hymns, weather, and church raffles when Miss Hargreaves casually mentioned the Priddle inquest, the one following Clara's so-called accidental drowning. Mrs. Whitcomb blinked, stirred her tea 3 times clockwise, and said, "Oh yes, I recall there was some urgency, wasn't there?" The verdict came so quickly, the Reverend said the evidence was too thin for delay. Poor Mr. Ashcombe, Clara's fiancé, left the very next day. Grief, of course, or perhaps something else. She smiled then, as if to dismiss her words, but Miss Hargreaves had already seized the thread. Expediency in death is rarely innocent. When questions are rushed, it usually means someone powerful prefers them unasked. But the past, like roots left wild beneath a garden, never stays buried for long. It pushes up, cracks foundations, waits for the right moment to reach daylight. And daylight nearly missed Elsinore that week. It was the milkman who first noticed bottles left untouched at noon, curtains unmoved. By dusk, the whispers had begun. Elsinore Vale was gone. Not at home, not at the bakery, not in church, nowhere. And when she returned, sometime after 4 in the morning, she was silent, pale, trembling. Her coat was damp, hair matted with twigs, and a single bruise darkened the skin just beneath her collarbone. When asked, she claimed she had gone walking and lost her way in the woods. But Miss Hargreaves, who had once traced a murderer by the mud on his boots, knew better. The soles of Elsinore's shoes were slick with silt, the kind found only near the abandoned riverbank beyond the mill path, a place no woman with sense would enter after dark. Her heels were scuffed as if she'd run, stumbled even, and her silence wasn't confusion. It was fear shaped like obedience. Miss Hargreaves said nothing, not then. She simply put on her walking coat, slipped a torch into her pocket, and visited two places: the thicket behind the derelict parsonage, and Meg Sallow's crumbling cottage near the overgrown footpath that hadn't seen use since Clara vanished. She found no answers, only broken branches, disturbed earth, the echo of something watching. But it was enough. Elsinore hadn't gone walking, she had gone back to something, or someone, and whatever she'd found hadn't let her leave without a mark. Silence is never truly empty, it always carries something with it: fear, a restless memory, or the eerie weight of something unsaid. But that night, the silence seemed to whisper something else entirely, as if a buried truth had finally clawed its way to the surface. Something had shifted in the air, something unseen but deeply felt, and Miss Marple knew then that this wasn't just an ordinary quiet, it was the kind that comes after something irreversible. The first to sense this disturbance was Mr. Bayle, the postman, a man attuned to the odd rhythms of the village, one who noticed the smallest disruptions. Basil Priddle, a man known for his precision and detachment, followed a strict routine. He retrieved the newspaper at 8 a.m. sharp, fed his cat Oliver by 9, and by noon, his ashtray was always cleaned. But that morning, everything was off. The curtains were still drawn, the kettle hadn't whistled, and the newspaper lay untouched at the doorstep like a silent warning. When finally, a neighbor at Mr. Bayle's urging entered the house, what they found was both ordinary and horrifying. Basil sat slumped in his chair, as if only resting his eyes, one hand dangling loosely by his side, the other frozen mid-motion. There was no peace on his face, no pain either, just a strange kind of surprise, as though death had interrupted a thought he never got to finish. On the side table next to him sat an old yellowed photograph, one from his youth with Clara, but the picture was torn, deliberately, and cruelly. Clara's figure was missing entirely, only a hand resting on Basil's shoulder remained. When Miss Marple was informed, she arrived without a word, her eyes scanning the room not for the body, but for the clues, the untold story scattered in the stillness. The teacup was untouched, the books were askew, and that torn photo, more than a token of sorrow, it looked like the scar of something deeper. Miss Marple had learned over time that natural deaths come with a certain stillness, but this room held a different tension, something unresolved, something screaming behind the silence. Basil had faced something before his final breath, something from the past, or a secret too unbearable, and perhaps he had lost. Dr. Hartridge, known for his calm demeanor and quiet intuition, was summoned. He didn't say much, just that the heart had stopped, but there were signs that suggested it hadn't stopped on its own. Basil's lips were dry, his fingertips faintly discolored with a purplish hue, signs Miss Marple had seen before, signs of poison. The doctor refused to issue a final certificate until further tests were done. Miss Marple simply nodded, storing that fact like a thread waiting to be pulled. She also noticed the chair, a few inches out of place, as if someone had stood behind him for too long, or had gotten up too quickly. She connected it with other details: the deep fading bruise on Eleanor's neck, the shadows under her eyes, and the whisper of a threat someone may have delivered to her in the dead of night. A theory began to form in Miss Marple's mind, hard and slow but relentless. If Basil had been silenced, then he had known something dangerous enough that someone couldn't let him speak. The only question now was who had the nerve to deliver that silence. By afternoon the village had reached its quiet conclusion. The polite ones didn't say much, but those who prided themselves on honesty had spoken. Eleanor Gray, she looked too much like Clara, stood to inherit too easily, and had been Basil's last visitor. Mrs. Finch, the baker, who also delivered milk, swore she'd seen Eleanor leaving the house the day before carrying something in her hand, but it was her eyes that struck her most, eyes that looked like they'd already made a decision, and left behind only silence. There was something unsettling about the morning Eleanor Gray passed through the village, the kind of subtle disruption that unsettles even the most mundane routines. Tubbs, the grocer, swore she was carrying a leather-bound notebook, clutched tight like a secret she wasn't ready to share, and when he greeted her as usual, she didn't respond, just walked past with a distant clouded look, as if her mind were tangled in something far darker than errands. Ivy Harmon, ever firm in her convictions, claimed she had always sensed guilt radiating from Eleanor, like a scent too faint for most to detect but obvious to those who had learned how to notice. Miss Marple, though far more reserved in her assessments, didn't ignore the weight of such gossip. She had long since learned that village tongues, for all their flaws, often pointed toward uncomfortable truths. Eleanor herself admitted to visiting Basil Priddle the morning of his death, claiming it was only to ask after family history, a harmless call. But Miss Marple had watched her carefully, noted the deliberate cadence of her voice, the way she chose her words too precisely, as though rehearsing a version of events she feared might be doubted. Then, there was Nigel Rossthorne, charming, respectable, and far too involved for someone with no formal ties. He expressed concern for Eleanor's well-being, suggested the visit may have overwhelmed Basil emotionally, and offered assistance to the vicar with funeral arrangements, to the doctor with inquiries, and to anyone else who would listen. It was the kind of generosity that wore a tailored suit and a practiced tone, and Miss Marple noticed how easily he recalled details from Basil's past, even those that hadn't been publicly known. More curious still, Nigel never questioned Eleanor, not once. Where others whispered, he defended her with haste, even before accusations had properly taken shape, as though anticipating the need to redirect suspicion. His grief felt rehearsed, his sympathy too symmetrical, and during the memorial service, Miss Marple watched him carefully as he avoided looking at the photograph of Clara, her image partially torn, eyes missing, smile erased. She knew then that something wasn't right. Over-polished sorrow, she always said, is the disguise behind which true guilt hides. That evening, she returned to Basil's final conversation with her, his hands trembling, face pale, the teacup rattling in its saucer. "She's come back to finish it," he'd said, not in confusion, but with a dreadful clarity. At the time it had seemed the fading gasp of a mind slipping into delirium, but now, it felt like a warning. Not just a return from a distant place, but a return to a moment, unfinished, unresolved, poisoned by something left to rot in silence. Miss Marple knew the language of the dying, their words curved around truths they could no longer hide. Basil hadn't feared madness, he feared someone remembering what they had tried so hard to forget, and someone else had ensured he would never speak of it again. That wasn't grief in the village, it was quiet anticipation, waiting for someone to misstep. And Miss Marple, who had seen shadows move beneath civility too many times to be fooled again, knew that this wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the start of something long buried, finally clawing its way back to the surface, and this time, it wouldn't go quietly. It was on an otherwise uneventful afternoon, under the quiet pretense of returning a borrowed book to the Priddle Library, that Miss Marlowe, whose movements were always graceful and never idle, found herself drawn to the upper shelves, where dust gathered in thick, undisturbed layers and forgotten volumes slept in shadows. One such book, a tattered collection of pastoral verse, slipped open too easily, as though it had been waiting. Between its yellowing pages, something fragile and oddly stiff emerged, a folded piece of aged newsprint, delicate as dried petals, the corners brittle, the ink faded but disturbingly intact. Her breath caught as she unfolded it, the headline cutting across time like a blade. "Broken engagement stuns local society. Miss Clara Priddle and Mr. Nigel Rossthorne part ways." The date, just 2 weeks before Clara's sudden and still whispered demise, struck her with chilling precision. Though brief, the article carried a sting that outlived its brevity. It described how Clara, once the paragon of quiet elegance, had returned her engagement ring in full public view, before a crowd of stunned onlookers at the midsummer fete, her voice calm, but resolute as she declared, irreconcilable differences of principle, a phrase deliberately vague, yet pointed enough to ignite scandal. The village had whispered ever since, crafting theories from scraps and shadows, but none had pierced the heart of the mystery. Why had Clara taken such a bold stance, only to be found lifeless, less than a fortnight later? Miss Marlowe, her fingers trembling only slightly, refolded the clipping with reverent care, and slipped it into her handbag, her mind not on gossip, but on cause, on the invisible fracture that splits lives apart. Principles, she thought with a quiet bitterness, are rarely tolerated by those whose comfort they threaten. Her next discovery, though disguised as chance, was no accident. Mrs. Lorridge, loyal housekeeper and an unwitting source of loose threads, had recently muttered something while dusting the old desk drawer in Priddle Cottage that refused to open, rattling as if something inside wished to be found. Miss Marlowe, ever attuned to overlooked details, had been waiting for just such an opening. When the opportunity arose, she moved with calm purpose. With a gentle tug and a firm nudge, the drawer gave way. Beneath a sheet of forgotten blotting paper, as if hidden not by accident but by intent, she uncovered a small silver locket, its surface dulled and scratched by time, yet unmistakably precious. Opening it, she found two miniature portraits, finely painted, hauntingly alike. One was unmistakably Clara, sharp-eyed, resolute, with that air of steely refinement the village knew too well. The other, softer, almost melancholic, with an expression cloaked in watchfulness, Elena Gray. But no more than that. The likeness was too exact. This was no cousin's coincidence. These were not two women connected by distant bloodlines, but by identical birth, twins, hidden, divided, one brought into the light, while the other was pushed into the shadows. This was no mere trinket. It was a memorial of something too dangerous to be acknowledged in daylight. The locket pulsed with a silent confession. Live split not by geography, but by design. Miss Marlowe's thoughts raced. If Clara and Elena, or Estelle, as she would soon be called, were twins, then someone had worked hard to ensure only one identity was ever allowed to thrive. The reason, perhaps a secret too combustible for society's fragile sensibilities. To follow this thread, she arranged a visit to Miss Hargrave, the retired headmistress of a girls' seminary in Eastbourne. The woman received her with dignified skepticism, offering a brittle smile and a porcelain teacup. At first her recollections were scripted and safe. Clara had been a model pupil, composed, intelligent, obedient. But Miss Marlowe's questions were carefully phrased, and her silences more persuasive than interrogation. Slowly something softened behind Miss Hargrave's frost. She glanced over her shoulder, lowered her voice, and set her cup down with trembling hands. There was another girl, she confessed, almost ashamed to say it. She came with Clara. They told us she was a cousin, Estelle. But there were no records, no surname, no guardians, just an arrangement, handled through a solicitor. And one day, without warning, she was gone. Removed, the head mistress leaned back, as if the memory unsettled her bones. We were told never to speak of her again. Miss Marlowe felt the air shift. The pieces clicked not with clarity, but with implication. A hidden twin, a concealed scandal, and perhaps the real reason Clara's engagement had shattered so abruptly, because secrets once unearthed have a way of reshaping everything around them. Clara had stood firm in public, not because of love lost, but because of a truth reclaimed. And for that truth, she may have paid with her life. It was a rain-slicked evening, the sort where fog clings to hedgerows like secrets too heavy to rise, when Miss Verity Dalloway, known to most in the village of Grenswick only as the quiet widow with a fondness for night-blooming jasmine, stepped into the dim hush of the parish records room on the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening almanac. The room, unused and thick with the scent of moth-eaten parchment, seemed to exhale history. As her fingers brushed the spines of forgotten volumes, one tome, the Register of Clerical Appointments, 1883, shifted slightly, as if nudged by unseen hands. From behind it a yellowing envelope, brittle at the edges, slid out and fluttered to the floor. It bore no address, only the faint imprint of the words to be read. "If I am gone," written in the unmistakable tremulous hand of Hester Vale, daughter of the esteemed Dr. Edwin Vale, whose disappearance 5 winters ago had been folded into the fabric of village myth and left there, undisturbed. The letter inside was written in ink that bled at the edges, but with words sharp enough to cut through time. It was not the musings of a woman unraveling, but the precise and fearful account of one who had seen behind the curtain of calm respectability. Hester wrote of silence, deliberate, suffocating silence. She spoke of irregularities in her father's patient ledgers, of prescriptions never written but somehow filled, of night visitors who never used the front door. Most haunting was her mention of an unsigned will, hidden in a hollowed-out Oxford dictionary, its clauses clean and convenient, transferring assets with suspicious ease. "I believe," she wrote, "someone intends to erase more than names. They mean to erase blood itself." Her final line was not dramatic, but chilling in its clarity. "If I vanish, it will not be from grief or madness. It will be because I stood in the way of someone's inheritance." The letter was dated 6 days before Vale House burned to the ground. What followed wasn't investigation, but something more calculated, a quiet removal. The ruins were cleared. Dr. Vale's estate was processed with alarming efficiency. No body had ever been recovered, no inquiry had pierced the veil, and the town, eager to return to its routines, accepted the loss like a swallowed cough. But Miss Dalloway, who had buried more than one truth in her lifetime, felt the tremor of something long buried stirring. A week later, under the gentle pretense of visiting Mr. James Crowthorne, the retired solicitor, who still kept a dusty office above the old butcher's shop, she noticed a cabinet locked, not with a key, but with a rusted brass pin. With careful distraction and sharper instinct, she gained access. Tucked beneath decades of tax receipts and forgotten deeds was a velvet pouch, almost reverently sealed. Inside, a cracked ivory cameo rested, its face split in two. One side bore Hester's distinct profile, the other was engraved with the initials CD, initials that stirred a deeper ache. Cecily Darnell, a name whispered like a ghost's, last seen 10 years ago, when she vanished from St. Mildred's Seminary, after confiding something too dangerous to her roommate. Miss Dalloway remembered the panic that followed, how Cecily's departure had been hastily labeled a runaway case, despite no sightings, no farewells, not even packed belongings. And now, in this locket, their fates, Hester and Cecily, seemed to clasp together like two sides of the same unspeakable story. Driven by intuition honed over decades of subtle watching, she sought out the only living witness to both girls' lives, Miss Audra Beecham, the once formidable music mistress, whose resignation after Cecily's disappearance had gone unquestioned. Her cliffside cottage was brambled in ivy, the door reluctant to open, but Miss Dalloway's persistence, paired with an offering of cinnamon tea and shared silence, cracked something deeper than a door latch. Audra, her voice hollow from years of self-imposed solitude, confessed both girls were daughters of Dr. Vale, half-sisters, one legitimate, one not. Cecily had discovered the truth, and more, she had threatened to bring it to light. Then she was gone, no trace, no inquiry, only a note, possibly forged, claiming Paris. Hester had known, had mourned, had feared. She stayed quiet, until she too, grew too close to telling. Miss Dalloway, seated by her fire that night with the locket laid bare, and Hester's letter smoothed beneath her fingertips, understood that the past had not vanished, it had been edited, carefully, deliberately. What had been passed off as madness, misadventure or misfortune was in fact orchestration, a tidy redirection of legacy and bloodline, and someone, still living among them, someone who wore respectability like a second skin, had conducted the entire affair like a silent symphony, erasing two lives so thoroughly, that the truth had begun to believe itself dead. But the truth had a way of seeping back, of finding breath in forgotten pages and broken heirlooms, and Verity Dalloway, whose life had taught her that justice often wore lace gloves, now sat with the pieces laid out before her, not as scattered echoes, but as a pattern, a design, one she intended to disrupt, because fire may destroy a house, but the smoke always finds a way into the lungs of those who tried to forget. The storm had passed, but the earth still held its breath. The skies above Elmshade House were smeared with the fading hues of dusk, casting a melancholic glow across the sprawling garden, where time itself seemed to falter. Inside the conservatory, shadows stretched long over the faded floral rug as Miss Agatha Langley, a woman dismissed far too often for her gentle tone and fondness for embroidery, prepared a gathering that was anything but ordinary. There were no formal invitations, only whispered suggestions of tea and pleasant company. And yet, Those who arrived did so with a quiet unease, as if drawn by something older than curiosity and colder than chance. Celeste Morwen sat closest to the window, her eyes reflecting the same still water her Aunt Helena had vanished into 2 years prior. She had come to the village not for answers, but for silence, hoping the ghosts of the past had long since settled. But she did not know what Helena had left behind, nor did she understand the weight of her resemblance, until she saw the flicker in Edwin Blackwood's eyes that day in church. He sat now across from her, his cufflinks gleaming, his face carved from restraint, while his wife Lillian, pale beneath her rouge, stirred her tea with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. Reverend Aldous and his wife Beatrice were also present, their expressions neutral, though the Reverend's fingers traced his wedding ring with absent-minded repetition. The room smelled of bergamot and roses, but beneath it was something more pungent, like forgotten paper, mildew and fear. Miss Langley smiled warmly, knitting bag beside her, though her hands remained still in her lap. She spoke at first of simple things. The fox seen prowling the baker's back steps, the upcoming charity drive, the daffodils blooming too early this year. Yet, even as she spoke, her words curled like smoke, seeping into every quiet corner. Then came the pivot, soft but deliberate. "You know," she began, her voice like lace over steel, "Helena was meticulous, too meticulous for an accident. She had recently begun noticing things, discrepancies, in the church accounts, in her sister's estate, small sums missing, redirected, mislabeled. She asked questions quietly. She recorded names, dates, amounts." A pause followed, thick and suffocating. Celeste blinked, her throat tightening. Edwin's fingers curled around the armrest, just once. Lillian's spoon clinked against her cup, then stilled. She confided in someone, Miss Langley continued, but not aloud, not in conversation. In writing. She left notes, a ledger, a letter, hidden inside a hollowed hymnal in her study. "I came across them, quite by chance, though I do believe Helena intended me to find them eventually." She turned her gaze to Edwin. "You see, Helena did not accuse," she observed, "and what she observed, I fear, would have ruined you." Edwin opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence bore down like thunderclouds, low and pressing. She had discovered unauthorized withdrawals linked to the trust her sister left Celeste, Miss Langley said softly, and more troubling, transfers routed through dummy charities. Now even Reverend Aldous's face had paled, and Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin trembling line. "Helena intended to confront you. But the morning she was to do so, she went for a walk, alone, down to the river, and she never came back." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The accusation lay not in pitch, but in truth. "I believe," she said, glancing to Celeste, "that your arrival reawakened what had long been buried. And I believe someone would prefer that truth stay buried at any cost." She stood then slowly, with the dignity of a judge. "But we owe Helena more than flowers and forgotten hymns, and Celeste deserves more than inherited danger. I intend to protect her. This time, the water will not take what is ours to defend." No one spoke. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the wind rose again, rustling the ivy against the windows, as if the house itself shuddered. Whatever peace had once cloaked Elmshade was gone. The past had returned, not as memory, but as reckoning, and this time, Miss Langley would not let the silence win. The drawing-room of Ashridge Hall seemed suspended in a breathless hush, the air thick with the ghosts of unspoken truths and long-buried secrets. Evelyn Hartley sat still, her presence deceptively delicate, but her voice, measured and low, began to unspool a truth that struck deeper than any scream. "Lena did not come back to claim an inheritance or revisit old griefs," she murmured, her eyes drifting past the faces in the room, Alaric's controlled facade, Miriam's tightening jaw, Reverend Cole's hands twitching at his collar. She was summoned, lured rather, called under the illusion of reconciliation, perhaps to mend fences, to revisit the legacy their family had left behind. But someone knew Lena too well, knew she would come if given hope. Evelyn's words were like needles, weaving an invisible thread, that connected the and the unforgivable. When her body was found near the riverbank, soaked and broken, the whispers began. Accident, misstep, sorrow. But I examined her hands, fingernails chipped, wrists bruised, and a single foreign thread, red silk, embedded in her sleeve. Lena didn't fall, she fought. Someone tried to silence her long before the river did. Miriam shifted in her seat, her pale face turning toward the fireplace, as Evelyn's eyes bore into her. And the will, amended weeks before Lena's return, assets scattered to ghost charities, bank accounts in names that don't belong to anyone real. She had started to dig, had written notes, her journal listed meetings, dates, strange absences of those closest to her. She suspected someone who walked these very halls. Her voice dipped, and with it, the temperature of the room seemed to fall. When Elise arrived, the sister she had once cradled as a child, bearing not only Lena's face, but her sharp mind and too many questions, someone's fear turned into desperation. The clinking of Alaric's ring against his glass was the only sound as Evelyn leaned in, her voice now intimate, almost mournful. Basil Wynne knew something, perhaps not everything, but enough. He had seen Lena the night before she vanished, said she looked frightened, whispered that she told him the house itself was watching. Basil never spoke directly of what he knew, but his eyes, they were heavy with guilt. Then Elise returned, and suddenly Basil began to unravel, not with time, but with fear. She drew a breath, slow and deliberate. His death came too soon, too quietly. A heart failure, they said. But I reviewed his final hours, a sedative masked as a digestive aid, delivered in the same tea he drank every evening, routine, harmless, trustworthy. Except this time, it wasn't. I found the vial, hidden behind the old history books. The label, handwritten, matched the notes Elise received, the anonymous ones warning her to stop. They weren't written by a man. The loops in the letters, the pressure of the pen, the rhythm, it was a woman with access, and motive. Evelyn turned her gaze fully to Miriam now, who froze, caught in a silence that screamed guilt. You feared Lena's voice echoing through Elise, feared the truth resurrected. You thought if you ended it again, it would vanish. But you misunderstood one thing. Time doesn't bury the truth, it ferments it. Her final words hung like a slow bell toll, grave and irreversible. You didn't just kill for greed, you killed for silence. But silence, my dear, remembers. And tonight, it spoke. The drawing room had fallen into that rare, breathless hush, where the air itself feels weighted by unspoken truths, a hush so deep it seemed to lean in, listening, urging the confrontation it knew was coming. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach Celia Brandt, who sat rigid as if the velvet-backed chair beneath her had turned to ice, her skin drained of color, and her fingers twitching in barely perceptible tremors, each one betraying the unraveling control behind her carefully composed facade. Miss Elwyn Drew, standing calmly near the heavy drapes, her eyes sharp with quiet wisdom earned not through hearsay, but through the long careful observation of human frailty, spoke not with accusation, but with that unsettling clarity that often frightens more than anger. You never meant to harm her, not truly, she said gently, but you needed her gone, before she uncovered something more dangerous than just a family resemblance, something buried, something rotten. Celia's lips parted but no words emerged, only the weight of years she had carried, a weight stitched with doubt and dread. The notes you sent were vague, Elwyn continued, stepping forward, the soft thud of her shoes against the Persian rug somehow deafening in the silence. Cryptic, anonymous warnings meant to unsettle, to create fear without substance, all except one. The one that read, "We know what happened." Her voice lingered on that line, drawing attention to the word we, an unsettling plural, one that suggested collective knowledge, shared guilt, or at the very least, collusion. That word was not a slip. It was a signal. You see, guilt rarely travels in groups. But secrets, they thrive in numbers. Celia's shoulders tensed as if bracing for a blow that had not yet landed, but already hurt. She looked away toward the mirror above the fireplace, where her own pale reflection stared back like a ghost reluctant to remember. You suspected, Elowen pressed on, even if you never confirmed. You knew Nigel's past was not without its shadows. You feared that Estelle's return would unearth truths long kept submerged under grief, lies, and carefully orchestrated silences. At the mention of Estelle, the air seemed to shift, as if her presence, even in absence, still lingered like perfume worn too long. Elowen reached into her worn leather bag, and withdrew 2 letters, laying them side by side on the oak table like artifacts from an excavation, one aged and worn, Marian's final note, riddled with familiar quirks. Letters transposed soft-spoken missteps that made her handwriting endearingly flawed. The other recent, written only days ago by someone imitating that hand with uncanny precision. You copied her well, Estelle, Elowen said, now turning to the younger woman who stood in the corner, arms folded tightly across her chest like armor. The cadence, the loops in the A's, even the way she crossed her T's late in the stroke. But you lacked one thing, her eros, her soul, and that omission, unintentional or not, was your undoing. Estelle flinched, not out of guilt, but recognition, a flash of realization dawning like cold light. But Elowen's gaze shifted again, this time to Nigel, who until now had remained so still he might have been mistaken for a portrait painted into the wallpaper, an image of dignity masking decay. The error wasn't hers, Elowen said softly, it was yours. Nigel's jaw clenched, the corners of his mouth tightened, but he said nothing, his silence suddenly louder than any defense. The forged letter found in the hymn book bore none of Marian's charming slips. It was polished, precise, crafted not to warn, but to deceive. You chose her voice, but used your spelling, and that in the end, was your mistake. You assumed perfection would go unnoticed, that no one would remember Marian couldn't spell possessions correctly even once in her life. The words hung heavy in the air, each one tightening the noose of implication. Nigel rose slightly from his chair, only to sit again, not out of choice, but surrender, as if the very weight of the truth had finally broken the frame of his composed demeanor. Sometimes, Elowen said, folding the letters and placing them gently back in her bag, the quietest clues are the loudest truths, not found in what is said, but in what is forgotten, habits, quirks, mistakes. A truth spoken aloud can lie, but a truth written carelessly often cannot. She turned to the vicar, who gave a solemn nod, accepting the verdict without the need for elaboration. Celia looked down, tears welling, but these were not tears of shock. They were the slow, bitter tears of someone who had once convinced herself that a lie was protection, that misdirection was mercy. Nigel did not protest, he only said that he would wait for the authorities. And as the fire sputtered behind them, and the drawing room once again fell to silence, Elowen stood still, listening to the last echo of deception dissolving into the only thing that ever outlives it, the truth. For those who had seen justice not just as a concept in law books, but as something that wore many masks, sometimes silent and sometimes late, but fair, and sometimes invisible yet inescapable. This moment wasn't just a legal culmination, it was a reckoning, a stillness that stripped every polished surface bare. The manor, once a beacon of power and legacy, now echoed with a silence that felt like truth itself had finally found a voice, not through words, but through the absence of all pretense. When the time came to arrest Julian Haverford, there was no spectacle, no flashing sirens, no clanging handcuffs, no shouting headlines, just a quiet, calculated execution of law wrapped in the formality of dignity. He didn't flinch or protest. He rose as if attending a final performance he had always anticipated. He adjusted his cufflinks with care, fastened the middle button of his coat, and glanced once at the people who had long admired him as a paragon of nobility and restraint. Then he spoke, with a composed voice that carried both civility and something unsettlingly rehearsed. "I will fully cooperate with the investigation." These weren't the words of a man stunned by his fate, but rather of someone who had trained himself for this fall, perhaps not out of guilt, but to preserve the illusion of control. When the ground finally gave way, Eleanor Gray watched him with a gaze that didn't scream betrayal, but searched for the very first crack in a mask worn too perfectly for too long, and that crack appeared not in Julian's expression, but in Lucinda's complete refusal to meet his eyes. The same Julian who once spoke eloquently about honor, sacrifice, and legacy, now stood hollow, his sorrow a performance, his remorse perfectly measured. When he was escorted out, the room began to empty slowly, the scrape of chairs, the whisper of doubt, the ripple of realization. But Eleanor stayed seated a while longer, as if she needed to absorb the final breaths of that unraveling space, knowing that guilt never arrives with drama. It creeps, it lingers, it builds like sediment under a river until the flow can no longer carry it. The next morning, when Camille Haverford arrived unannounced at Eleanor's cottage, she looked like she had crossed a battlefield. No one else could see, eyes red, not from sleep, but from the unrest that keeps truths buried, and fingers clutched tightly around a pair of gloves like they were the last thing anchoring her. Her voice didn't carry guilt, it carried exhaustion, like someone unburdening a truth that had long been pressing down on her lungs. She said she didn't know everything, but had always suspected there was something foul behind Julian's wealth, something that Lucinda's return and Benedict's quivering voice had finally made too loud to ignore. "I thought I was protecting what little dignity we had left," Camille whispered, "but all I was doing was masking the rot that had already seeped through." Eleanor didn't scold her, nor did she offer forgiveness. She simply handed her a warm cup of tea, and in that calm voice of hers, said that women often end up carrying the weight of sins they never committed, sometimes even shielding those they should have let go of long ago. When Camille left, there was no closure, no cinematic redemption, just the quiet unraveling of a woman who had lived too long inside someone else's lie. Eleanor watched her go and thought of Lucinda, the girl who had once been erased, replaced, and reduced by the very family who claimed to protect her. And Lucinda, now living as Althea Moore, stood once again before the grave marked with her sister Clara's name. The soil was still damp, but the letters had begun to fade. Beneath her fingers, she held a small silver locket once hidden, and now gleaming, like the truth she no longer had to conceal. She hadn't come to ask for forgiveness. Clara had never blamed her. The distance between them hadn't come from hate, but from a wound time took years to acknowledge. As the soft rain began to kiss the earth, she whispered her sister's name, not for justice, not for vindication, but simply for remembrance. What they had shared was not sisterhood in the way the world so conveniently defines it, not the easy intimacy of shared birthdays, childhood scraps, or whispered secrets across pillows in the dead of night, but something far more spectral, more unsettling, as though their connection had bloomed not from memory, but from longing. It was not built on shared moments but on absences, the absence of knowing, the absence of explanation, the absence of a presence that should have been felt but never was. Through the faded edges of letters, neither fully understood nor addressed, through the haunting parallels in their facial symmetry captured in old yellowing photographs, tucked in drawers, through the almost unnerving way their expressions seemed to echo one another's joys and wounds, Estelle had come to recognize not just a sister, but a version of herself that had lived in shadow. She moved toward the grave with the deliberate quiet of someone not merely carrying flowers or trinkets, but bearing the unbearable weight of unspoken history. Her fingers trembled not from the cold, but from the invisible pressure of years spent wondering what might have been, if only a name had been spoken, if only a letter had arrived, if only the truth hadn't been wrapped in layers of family shame. She knelt slowly, each movement deliberate, almost sacred, and placed the locket down like a final punctuation at the end of a sentence that had taken her whole life to write. But she did not cry. There were no tears left, only the still ache of a sorrow long aged and weathered, the kind that carves its shape inside you over time, silently, like a river hollowing rock. Behind her, Miss Hawthorne remained still, standing a respectful distance away among the gravestones, her silhouette softened by a veil of morning mist. She said nothing, offered no words of comfort, because she knew too well that some griefs are not to be comforted, but simply witnessed, held in quiet reverence like fragile porcelain that might shatter under careless touch. She understood that what Estelle had found wasn't closure as people so often expect it, not a neat ending tied with a bow, but something quieter and more honest. A release of questions that would never be answered, a surrender to the ache of not knowing. And when Estelle rose, she didn't glance back, she didn't need to. Something had shifted. What was once hidden in layers of silence had been exposed to light. What had long remained unnamed was now acknowledged. And in the silent garden that bordered the cemetery, where memory hung like fog over forgotten stones and the river whispered secrets along its banks, something had begun to grow. It was fragile, yes, and impossibly slow, but it was real. A beginning perhaps, not in the hopeful sense, but in the truthful one. Days later, as mist hugged the village like a memory reluctant to leave, Miss Hawthorne took tea in Reverend Whitlow's modest study, where even the furniture seemed to creak with the weight of unresolved truths. The scandal, once a wildfire of rumor and raised brows, had begun its slow retreat into the folds of local folklore, twisted by retellings, softened by sentiment, coated with the village's signature varnish of polite denial. The Reverend, gracious and weary, poured tea and offered biscuits with practiced kindness, yet his eyes, usually calm, held a flicker of something else, unease perhaps or unspoken curiosity. Miss Hawthorne sipped slowly, her gaze distant, her words careful. "It is never the confession that exposes the guilty," she said, stirring her tea in slow circles, "but the mistake they don't know they've made, the moment of performance that slips, the detail too perfect to be real." She spoke of Eleanor's hands trembling, not from nerves, but from memory, of Basil's dying words that had been oddly rehearsed, of Camille's perfect spelling in letters she'd claimed were written in haste, of silences that stretched just a moment too long. Each inconsistency alone had been dismissible, but together, they formed a mosaic, a hidden pattern, visible only to those who knew where to look. "Guilt," she added, "isn't loud, it's meticulous. It tries to hide by being neat." The Reverend nodded, and for a moment, silence wrapped around them like wool. It was not the silence of comfort, but of recognition. Outside, in the garden that surrounded Miss Hawthorne's home, a place once left to overgrowth and the muteness of past seasons, April rains had softened the earth. Underneath the lilac tree, in the farthest corner, where the sunlight crept in slowly like cautious forgiveness, 2 rose bushes had begun to bloom. They had been planted years ago by Clara Priddle during her final summer. One bore red blossoms dark as dried blood, the other pale white like ghost breath. For years they had refused to flower, as though the soil itself mourned what had been buried with Clara. But now, against all odds, petals had begun to unfurl. Miss Hawthorne, with her straw hat and gardener's gloves, tended to them not as flowers, but as symbols, evidence that even what lies dormant for years can be coaxed back to life. She whispered to them, not in magic, but in memory, and paused with her shears in hand, watching the red and the white bloom side by side. There was no magic in it, nothing that defied nature, and yet, something about their return felt like a message, a quiet assurance from the earth itself that truth, even buried, finds a way back. That healing, though slow and silent, always begins beneath the surface. Side by side with the descending hush of twilight, she felt something ancient and unspoken shift quietly inside her. Not a revelation but a slow untangling, as though her very soul exhaled for the first time in years. It wasn't forgiveness that filled her chest. Not exactly, it was more delicate than that, more complicated. Not forgetfulness either, for the past had roots too deep to simply be erased. No, what bloomed in her was a kind of worn but tender reconciliation, not with others but with herself, with the truth she had carried like a stone in her pocket for so long. Evelyn had left the village not with scandal or shame dragging behind her like a train, but with a silence so composed it unsettled those who remained. Those who wanted drama, who needed a villain to point to, who could not understand that dignity can sometimes be the final defense of the wounded. She spoke no bitter words, offered no explanations, only a simple goodbye that echoed louder than any accusation. No one dared ask more, not even Miss Alara, who had seen the storm behind Evelyn's eyes and chose instead to honor the quiet. The locket, once a glimmering secret and now tarnished by time, remained buried at the foot of Jonathan's grave, its clasp tight around memories too heavy to carry, but too sacred to discard. Its silence spoke volumes, and the village with its endless rhythm of days and seasons moved forward as all small places do. Whispers became background noise, stories softened around the edges, and new routines blossomed like ivy creeping up old walls. A young curate was said to be arriving soon, fresh from theological college and completely unaware of the tragedies sown into the soil beneath his feet. Mrs. Haltridge had taken in a new tenant, a quiet man who claimed to be a writer, but was seen more often peering at people than pages. The bakery had a new girl, all laughter and clumsy hands, who regularly overcharged for currant buns but disarmed everyone with her bubbling apologies and crooked smile. The roses returned, defiantly beautiful, red and white blooming together now. Where once there had been division and secrecy, there was now a strange harmony. Miss Alara stood in her garden, fingers brushing a single petal, and thought, not for the first time, that truth is not always clean. It can wound as it heals, leave behind scars even as it sets things right. But when truth is named, when it is finally dragged into the open and allowed to breathe, it clears the ground, and only in cleared ground can anything truly grow. She lingered for a moment, the breeze at her back light and cool, her shadow falling long across the soil. There was still work to do, there always would be, but the weight in her chest had lessened. The garden, once strangled in shadow, now held color again. Color born not from denial, but from acknowledgement, and it was in its own quiet way, breathtaking, because sometimes the truth doesn't crash in with thunder or confessions, sometimes it creeps back into the world like a melody you thought you'd forgotten, or the bloom of two neglected roses finding life again in the spring. In this village, in St. Romelda's hollow, justice never shouted. It rustled through hidden drawers, whispered in the cracks of old letters, slipped beneath floorboards and into trembling hands. And it was Miss Alara's quiet persistence, her gift for noticing not what was loud, but what was missing, that finally gave voice to the silence around Jonathan's death. In the end, it was not outrage or vengeance that unearthed the truth, but memory, patience, and the quiet certainty of a woman who understood that guilt rarely wears a villain's face. It hides in overly practiced grief, in kindness sharpened too fine, in smiles that arrive just a beat too soon. What solved this mystery was not confrontation, but the slow peeling away of lies, the realization that even the best-kept secrets eventually fray at the edges. And so I ask you, dear listener, if you saw someone long dead, standing as if not a day had passed, would you trust your senses, or dismiss it as illusion? Would you speak the truth, or swallow it for the comfort of others? What do you do when the past knocks not as a ghost, but as a shadow that still breathes? Tell us, what would you have done? Share your thoughts, your suspicions, your astonishment. Which moment haunted you most? What truth caught you off guard? Your reflections help others uncover these stories, just as Miss Alara unearthed hers. And if this tale stirred your thoughts or tugged at your heart like the rustle of wind through forgotten trees, subscribe for more. There are always more mysteries to unravel, more secrets waiting beneath the surface, and more women like Alara, armed only with memory, a cup of tea, and the fierce grace to see what others overlook. Until next time, keep watching the quiet corners, for it is in stillness that the truth most often speaks.